William Wordsworth is a famous poet of the mid-19th century, and this is one of his famous poems. Wordsworth was a key figure in a poetic movement called Romanticism. Romanticism in this context doesn't have anything to do with romance as we commonly think about it. It doesn't refer to love or sexual relationships. Romanticism in English poetry refers to a style of poetry that emphasizes intuition and feeling over reason and logic. It typically contains rural settings rather than urban settings, and mostly romantic poetry uses simple language rather than academic language. I don't mean to go off on a long tangent here, but any time an artistic style or period comes to prominence, it's almost always a reaction to the artistic style or period that came before it. This is true of all art forms: music, painting, literature, film, whatever. In the 18th century, for example, let me stop and make sure we understand one thing. When I say the 18th century, I'm talking about the 1700s. When I say the 19th century, I'm talking about the 1800s. Anytime you're reading history, it's important to understand that. So the 20th century was the 1900s, and we're now in the 21st century, but it's the 2000s, not the 2100s. Okay, that's a little side trip. Now back to the point. When we have an artistic period, it's virtually always a reaction to the period that came before it. So the second half of the 18th century, the 1700s, we call the Age of Enlightenment. The emphasis was on reason and logic and science. Art forms were influenced by that. Poetry in the 18th century is very formal. It's more political than personal, and it features a learned vocabulary. It reflects the spirit of the Enlightenment. But by the mid-19th century, the 1800s, poets were reacting against all of that and writing poems with a different set of values and priorities. Okay, so that's perhaps more background than you want on this little poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Let's take a look at it. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Well, there's nothing very complicated about that. The phrasing is pretty. The rhymes are regular and precise. The rhythm is consistent. It flows. So the speaker is out wandering around the hillside and comes across a huge field of daffodils. A host of daffodils. The word host is kind of a 19th century word that means more than you can count. Here are a couple of pictures of daffodils, something like the speaker might have seen. It might also be worth noting, since we aren't from England, that Wordsworth lived and wrote in northern England in an area known as the Lake District. So the area he knew well was hilly, very picturesque, and contained a lot of lakes. So in the second stanza, he describes these daffodils in more detail. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The word sprightly means lively, full of life and energy. The term we haven't talked about yet is personification. I'm sure you all encountered that word in high school. It's a literary device whereby non-human objects are given human characteristics. The daffodils are tossing their heads in sprightly dance. Daffodils don't have heads exactly, and they certainly don't dance. Those are human qualities. By using personification to describe the daffodils, the poet conveys the impression of life and animation. Now the sauce begins to thicken in the third stanza. The poem starts to transform itself from one thing into something else a little more complex. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. The word jocund, by the way, means full of joy. It's kind of a 19th century word. Also, I guess I might mention that the word gay is almost never used in our world without its referring to homosexuality. But the word gay throughout most of its history has simply meant happy. The last two lines, however, are the most important. The poet has looked with joy on these beautiful daffodils, but the sight has brought him a kind of wealth that he didn't realize at first. We have to read the last stanza, however, before we find out what that wealth is. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. The word vacant here means empty. He's lying on his couch, just kind of zoned out, not thinking about anything. Pensive means thoughtful, but with an element of sadness. You know how that is. Perhaps it's Saturday afternoon, you're lying on your bed, it's pouring down rain, all your friends are gone or busy, and you start thinking about life and what the future holds, and you just feel a little bummed. That's pensive. So what happens? He's lying on his couch, in vacant or in pensive mood, and then he thinks of those beautiful daffodils. They flash upon that inward eye. The inward eye is memory. It's the ability of the mind to recapture an image from the past. And this inward eye is a sort of bliss or extreme happiness that occurs when we are by ourselves and let our minds wander to where we've been and what we've done. So when he thinks of this beautiful scene, his heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. It's not a difficult poem at all. But what's the subject and what's the theme? The subject is simply memory. And remember, the theme is an attitude or impression or idea about the subject. So we might say that the theme is that our good memories can bring us pleasure in our moments of solitude and pensiveness. It's a beautifully written little poem that makes a simple but important point.